If I asked you to name some of the great epidemics of the last century, I'm pretty sure you'd say cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, measles, or perhaps even Asian flu. But I'll take a bet that you wouldn't mention depression amongst them. And yet, depression must rank as one of the great epidemics of all time. In this series of 5 programs, I want to explode some of the myths that we have about depression. For example, would you consider that Winston Churchill was a weak man, or that he was mad or mentally ill? Well, Winston Churchill suffered from depression, from long bouts of depression that he called Black Dog. And in fact, Lord Moran, his biographer, has written about Winston Churchill's experiences in such a way that describes a man that at different times in his life was unable to cope with the enormous sadness that came across him for no apparent reason. Now, if Winston Churchill was weak, or if Winston Churchill was mad, then we must all be mad.
Of course, Churchill wasn't mad, but he was human in that life got him down from time to time, just like it does for most of us. The fact that no one except his closest friends knew of his bouts of depression suggests a very private side to a very public man.
It's very hard to imagine that on a lovely day like this, anybody could really be feeling depressed. But for many people on a day like this, if they're depressed, the whole weight of the sky is bearing down upon them. The colour of the water is grey and dull. The trees seem to be lifeless and meaningless. In fact, this could be a very hostile environment. I remember a young guy once telling me that depression is rather like going into a long, dark tunnel with no light at the end. And in a sense, I can understand that feeling because it's an oppressive feeling. It's as if, as I enter this tunnel, it's as if the darkness begins to close right in upon me. It's a very hard thing to understand, but depression can take you over completely and can leave you utterly unable to respond in any way to the simplest things around you. But when I look down at the other end of the tunnel and I realize I can see a glimmer of light, it's a glimmer of hope. It's something that makes me feel that it's worth going forward. For most people, there is hope and there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it's worth waiting for.
Someone who's experienced the long, dark tunnel of depression and emerged from it a stronger person is actress Judy Geeson. Several years ago, her world was shattered when the man she loved died suddenly. Losing someone you love is a deeply distressing experience at any age, but particularly so when you're younger, because the loss is always so unexpected. I asked Judy what she felt was the hardest thing to cope with at the time.
Emptiness. An emptiness and a loneliness. I think the worst feelings that anybody can have, you know, that I think loneliness is an awful, awful feeling. And it's a totally different feeling from being alone to actually feeling that loneliness for one person. You can be with people, but still feel terribly alone. And I don't think I allowed those feelings to come too near, kept them well at bay for a long time. And then when they did hit me, then I was aware of a horrible emptiness.
Do you consider that you were really depressed at any time during that period?
Yes, I think not in the first year, no. I think in the first year the shock is so immense that you fight anything. You're fighting so hard to keep your head above water that I don't think depression actually comes into it until Well, at least for me, until I think the second year, when the real truth hits you. And then I obviously was depressed. I don't think I stood outside and said, oh, you're depressed. I think I was just down.
Whether you're down or depressed doesn't alter the fact that coping can become a bit of an effort. For some people, the tunnel is a very real and very frightening experience. But just how many people get to this stage?
Goodness, well, it's one of the problems really, is deciding what you mean by depression, again, when you're going to say something like that. There are probably about 25% of the population who feel depressed.
So, I mean, that's incredible. The 25% is somewhere in the region of 15 million people.
That's right. It's an enormous number of people. And these are the people who are taking the 53 million prescriptions of tranquilizers that are prescribed every year, and the people who take the 100,000 overdoses a year. But only
sorry, I've got to... Can you say that again? 100,000 overdoses a year?
There are over 100,000 overdoses in Britain every year as well. Well, those are people who are suffering from a transient change in mood, usually. But of those 25%, probably only about 2% would have a serious depressive illness, a really severe one that needed to go into hospital with. But there's an awful lot of people out there in the real world who've got feelings of depression or anxiety or some sort of symptom that tells us underneath that they're depressed. Perhaps we haven't made that clear that there can be other symptoms, like, for example, becoming irritable or having backache and headaches that don't really have any physical cause, or developing a sexual problem, or difficulty with shoplifting, gambling, turning to alcohol. Those often are masked depressions, and those would all be included in that 25%.
Wouldn't it be nice if you could put depression under the microscope like you can a simple virus? Because if you could probably isolate a cause much more simply than we're able to do today. One of the big problems with depressive symptoms is that they don't fall into any simple category, not like, for example, a flu virus. Now, I get about 30 letters a day from depressed people, and each one of them is in its own way a completely different story. It's a story about people not coping. It's a story about failure. Each one of these people in some way is showing a cry for help. They're saying to me, what can I do? I don't understand my symptoms and I don't understand my problems. Stress is something that we all experience. Take this car, for example. When you're driving, it's under constant stress. But if you push it beyond its capabilities, then the chances are that sooner or later it's going to break down. If you're lucky, you'll be able to repair the damage. But if not, it's likely that it'll end up on a scrap heap. And that's precisely what happens to you and me when we push ourselves too hard.
Now, we all need stress, which is just a sensory input. And most of us find stress a stimulus. What we are concerned about, of course, is the odd person for whom what should be a stimulus turns out to be something highly disruptive. Now, this can be because the level of sensory input is too high, or it could be because he has an impaired ability to respond rationally to his sensory input. Perhaps I could illustrate what I mean by reference to this rubber band. Now, I'm going to stress this rubber band, and it stretches like that, and then when I let go again, it comes back to its original shape. Now, of course, if I were to really apply too much force, it would eventually break. But it's perfectly normal for rubber bands to be stretched, and it is perfectly normal for human beings to have a certain level of stress or stimulus, provided they can respond rationally to it. Now, here I have another apparently identical rubber band which has perished to some extent. And if I apply the same pull to this, I think you'll find it will break. Yes, it has. Now, the same pull was applied to both, but one broke and the other didn't. So this is where I think we're very defective in much of our present talk about stress-related illnesses, such as perhaps depression or the various other diseases that we talk about in a loose sort of way as associated with stress. It isn't just the intensity of the pull, the intensity of the sensory input which we need to consider, but also we need to consider the structural integrity of the organism, the structural integrity of the nervous system. And certainly things can happen to a person's nervous system which render them less able to accommodate sensory input, or what we call stress. So that instead of responding rationally and in a balanced way and bouncing back, they snap.
I think there were stresses that I could have coped with. For some reason I didn't. At that stage, I think I've had as much stress at other times in my life, and I've coped. This time, no, I couldn't.
Sue Chipchase, who had always been able to manage quite well, found herself becoming depressed after a series of problems. The pressure was just too great. How did she feel when this happened?
Physically, pretty awful. I would start shaking, I would cry an awful lot. I couldn't see any point to my life, to the children's life. I felt that they had no outlook. There was such difficulty in getting jobs. There were so many problems that life for none of us was worth, that's not good English, is it, was worth going on. I felt that things had been better. I could look out of the window and I could see trees. I could also see the graffiti. And it was the graffiti that I could see. I didn't notice the trees, the flowers. And that isn't me. I love the country, I love the trees. And suddenly all I could see was the little bit of bark that had been torn away. Silly things, yes. Nothing good at all. No future.
Could you sleep?
No, I didn't sleep. I kept everybody else awake too, tramping around the house, sending my husband down for anything to drink that might knock me out. I would go to sleep, I would go to bed very, very tired. At 2 o'clock, without fail, that was it. I was awake for the rest of the night. Which made my husband suffer too, because I couldn't bear to be awake and him asleep next to me, so I'm afraid I woke him up too. Very unkind.
The word depression can be anything from feeling a bit down in the dumps right through to the other end where somebody's having a major psychiatric illness requiring hospital admission. Now, if we start at that end of the spectrum with the really dark black depression that quite clearly is an illness, then people have a range of symptoms that we medically can recognise as being depression. And that would include feelings of hopelessness, feeling suicidal, feeling that really life has nothing to offer anymore. You get all sorts of physical symptoms like difficulties with sleep, often early morning awakening. People usually go off their food, lose weight, become slowed up in a rather strange way. We call it retardation. And they feel low in self-esteem. They just don't feel that they're worth anything anymore. They withdraw, they don't want to go out, and they don't want to face the world. And it really is quite a serious illness without any doubt at all, and there's a risk of suicide. They blame themselves. Often they even develop delusions. It's a very serious illness. But there's all sorts of grey areas between that very severe depression and feeling well, and those are the ones that we tend to see the most. People just feel depressed perhaps for a period of 3 or 4 weeks, or they feel anxious, get very uptight. We use words like uptight at times like that. Or we may get symptoms of body getting upset. We may get headaches, a whole pile of headaches, or upset tummy, or skin trouble, or some sort of somatic disturbance which tells us that our body's out of sorts.
But why do you think it is then that some people are more vulnerable to depression, to this real depression, than others?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question to answer. There's no doubt that some people have a sort of family history of depression. You know, it goes back through the generations. That's a few people. But more people, it's a combination of things. They may have had problems in the childhood. They may have had a death of a parent in childhood, which means you're more vulnerable. For other people, it may be they just had a very sort of unhappy childhood, lots of disturbance all the way through. And then there's a lot of other reasons, if you want me to go into those, like the fact that women are more vulnerable to depression than men, and if we've got small children at home, we're more vulnerable. If we've not got a very good relationship with our husband, and if we're not working, and if we're working class, these sorts of things make us more vulnerable. But usually there has to be some what we call a precipitating event. Something has to happen, like, you know, lose somebody or move house, or some fairly major stress has to go on in addition to those vulnerabilities.
We had moved actually just a week before I had the hysterectomy. It's only now that I'm beginning to sort things out. I wasn't capable or able to or wanted to. I didn't even want to know. Like they were outside in this lovely new house. Wasn't interested. It wasn't a home.
What was going on in your head during these times?
I was looking for the bad things in life. I literally was searching my mind for all the dreadful things that could happen. But I was very ashamed of it. I was ashamed that I had to resort to tablets. I was very ashamed of the way I was feeling. And I tried to hide it.
Why ashamed?
Because I had so much to be grateful for, really. And yet I could still feel as if everything was going wrong.
Again, I've got to ask you, how fair is that on you, really? I mean, that you had everything to be grateful for. In a sense, you're rather punishing yourself, aren't you, by saying that?
Perhaps, I don't know. I had a lot to be thankful for. I mean, I had a home. I had children that were good. They didn't go out on the town and really should have caused me no problems, no worry. The worries I made myself. I think shame is the one thing that sticks out in my mind.
Do you remember what the shame was about?
I didn't really understand, no. It was just this awful darkness, blackness, great long tunnel. And somehow I'd got to get to the other end of it. And I didn't feel that anybody could help me, really. I had nobody to go to talk to that knew how I felt, that could say to me, soon you'll come out of that.
What actually happens to the body when we get depressed?
Well, it's a whole body reaction. There are changes in body chemistry, particularly, which is my main area of interest. When we're under stress, we liberate a variety of stress-related hormones, things like adrenaline, that there's quite a lot of talk about in the popular press, and another more important hormone, particularly in relation to depression, called noradrenaline. Because this is a sort of kick, drive hormone, which is liberated in times of crisis. And what it does is turn you on both physically and mentally. And in the right amounts, it can actually make you feel really good, dynamic, with it, sexy, turned on, and the rest of it. But the problem is that when you get too much of it, when it goes over the top, and particularly when the anger and aggression is directed inwards, then depression results.
Can you illustrate that point for me in some way?
Yes. For example, if you drew a picture of the P for pleasure levels in people's lives and the stress levels, you start off right down here on the curve, where, if, for example, a bored housewife at home or somebody who's unemployed, there's little stimulus, little stress, but also little pleasure. And then gradually you go up towards a maximum, but it's all too easy to flip over the top, and then you sort of go into a nosedive, and you get to the overstressed point where pleasure goes right down, and you're in the overstressed state where a whole variety of unfavorable changes, as well as the diminution in pleasure, occurs. So this is the classical overstressed executive state, or people exhausted after a really major life event.
Not all depressions are, in fact, stress-related depressions, are they?
No, they're not. A proportion apparently arise from within, and I think there
you do need the best of orthodox conventional medicine, and certain things like lithium can produce almost miraculous cures. But unfortunately, I think they're the relative exceptions, and often we're dealing with a whole range of stress-related factors in people's daily lives, and also possibly influencing their chemical makeup in relation to changes in certain elements in their diet, certain heavy metals, for example, whether it's lead or whether it's cadmium, or there's another theory of depression related to the metal known as vanadium. And that's why some ancient dietary theories that vegetarian diets, for example, with a lot of vitamin C in them, can actually help people with depression. And modern evidence is emerging in this field, which was once regarded as an old wives' tale and very much laughed at.
There may, however, be other factors connected with depression. For example, environmental pollution. Do we know how much effect all this exhaust is having on the people who live and work in these buildings?
Pollution of the environment concerns everybody because every one of us is subject to its effects, whether it's lead in petrol, cigarette smoke in the office, or chemicals sprayed on the food we eat. How do we know, for example, whether changes in our moods may not actually be the result of chemical agents acting upon the body? I asked Derek Bryce-Smith, Professor of Organic Chemistry at Reading University, if he thought depression could be explained in chemical terms, taking into account things like pollution, rather than merely as a response to pressures in our lives.
Well, at the most fundamental level, depression is a result of some sort of malfunction of the brain. In particular, some sort of malfunction of the chemistry of the brain, we believe now. And that can be caused by chemical influences. It can be caused by a deficiency of certain nutrient substances which are required for the normal function of the nervous system, or it can be caused or exacerbated by the presence of certain neurotoxic substances, or substances like mercury or lead, which can interfere with the functioning of the nervous system. And of course, the fact that we so often in conventional psychiatry now give depressed patients chemical drugs is in itself a tacit admission that we're dealing with chemical disturbances in the brain.
Have you ever wondered how good the food is that we consume every day? I don't mean how good it tastes, but how good it is for you in nutritional terms. Many of the things that we buy in supermarkets are highly refined or contain additives which fail to make up for the goodness that is taken out of them. What this means is that some of us aren't getting enough of what is good for us, while others may be getting what is bad for them. Surprising though it may seem, you can actually be allergic to certain foodstuffs, and there is evidence that such allergies can contribute towards depression. So why is it that we seem so unconcerned about what we put into our bodies?
I think it is mainly because we don't respect our bodies. We haven't been taught to do this, and some while ago we discovered that we could cure various symptoms with things like aspirin, which was about 80 years ago, and now we think we've got a license to cover up any symptoms at all just by killing the effect. And the body now is beginning to find that it can't take all these substances plus all the additives in the air and in our food.
Well, I get a lot of letters from people who ask whether allergies might be the cause of their ups and downs. I mean, do you think that they can?
Absolutely, definitely, yes.
What Dr. Lester is saying is that depression can, in certain cases, be a reaction to particular foods or additives in foods, a subject that I shall be pursuing with him in a later program. So, if the causes of depression can be said to include the food we eat and the physical environment in which we live, on top of the stresses that we're subjected to every day of our lives, the conclusion I have to draw is that people become depressed for a variety of different reasons. and that to look for a single cause is neither helpful nor particularly productive.
But if 25% of the population are so depressed that they need help, then we clearly have an epidemic on our hands. And this means that we're just not looking in the right directions for the answers. Perhaps what we've got to do is be a little bit more open-minded.
If you feel you need someone to talk to at any time, then you may like to know that we've produced a free directory of useful names and addresses covering a wide range of organisations from whom you can receive help and support. If you'd like a free copy, then please write to Someone to Talk To, Thames Books, P.O. Box 2LE, London W1A 2LE.